The lamps of Rome flicker against marble walls, and somewhere beyond the Palatine Hill, the quiet rhythm of invention begins, not of empire, but of ink and paper, whispering a future no one in Augustus's world could yet imagine. As we drift into this alternate past together, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Or perhaps, when was the last time you found yourself thinking about the Roman Empire? Please let us know in the comments below. Now, let's begin. What if the Romans invented the printing press? The first light of dawn finds the city of Rome hushed and expectant. A pale glow creeps over the tiled rooftops and marble temples, illuminating streets that have yet to stir. In a small scriptorium near the Forum, a lone oil lamp flickers, its gentle light dancing on walls lined with scrolls. The air is heavy with the scent of papyrus and ink. Here, a scribe works in silence, copying a text by steady hand. Each stroke of his reed pen across the fibrous sheet is deliberate and careful, as it has been done for centuries. It is a patient labor of knowledge, one letter at a time, one scroll after another, preserving words for future generations. In this quiet hour, Rome holds its breath between past and future. The Augustan Empire stands at its zenith, a realm stretching from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the fertile crescent of Syria. Roads bind together a mosaic of peoples and cities. Courier riders carry news across continents. Libraries safeguard the wisdom of Greece and Egypt under Roman watch. And yet, even in this age of prosperity and order, the spread of information is bound by ancient limits. A decree issued in Rome takes weeks to reach Gaul, copied by countless hands along the way. A single book requires months of labor to reproduce, each copy a treasured artifact. Knowledge lives, but slowly and tenuously, at the mercy of time and flame. But what if that were to change? What if, in this very moment at the height of the Pax Romana, a new invention emerged, one that could copy words as easily as the striking of a coin, that could multiply knowledge as effortlessly as the empire raises legions? What if the Romans, 18 centuries before Gutenberg, had invented the mechanical printing press? The story we know, of knowledge guarded in monastic vaults only to be set free by Renaissance presses, would be utterly transformed. In its place would be another narrative entirely, one where the floodgates of information opened in antiquity, where ideas spread like wildfire on ink and papyrus, where the trajectory of religion, science, and society changed course under the influence of mass-printed words. This is not idle fantasy, but a journey into an alternate past balanced on the edge of innovation. History often pivots on a single discovery as much as on battles or the rise and fall of kings. The printing press in our timeline was one such pivot, a force that shattered medieval constraints and ushered in the modern world. If introduced in ancient Rome, under the enlightened gaze of Augustus, its impact would have cascaded through every aspect of civilization. Tonight, we step into that parallel world. We stand in the golden forums and quiet libraries of an imperial capital 2 millennia ago, and watch as a revolution of the mind is born in ink and parchment. The implications stretch across centuries. Some historians argue that an early printing revolution could have propelled the Roman Empire to even greater heights, or at least preserved its wisdom through the ages, preventing the long darkness that fell over Europe. Others suggest that the conservative structures of ancient society might have stifled such an invention, or twisted it to serve authority alone, delaying its liberating power. The truth, as always, lies in the fertile ground between these extremes. To understand what might have been, we must first understand what was, the world of the Romans as it existed, and how one spark of innovation might ignite a flame of change. Let us begin our journey in that still and hopeful dawn. The year is 20 BCE, and the Emperor Augustus rules a realm at peace after generations of civil war. Under his patronage, literature and learning flourish. Virgil, Ovid, and Livy write works that will resonate through the ages, copied and shared in scrolls passed from hand to hand. In workshops and vineyards, craftsmen labor with presses that squeeze olives into oil and grapes into wine, never imagining those same mechanisms could imprint letters onto page. But soon, imagination will leap. The sun climbs higher over Rome's 7 hills, and with it rises the possibility of a new world. In the soft light of morning, the eternal city is poised on the brink of an invention that will echo through all of history's corridors to come. The spark of innovation hour. Journey's point of divergence comes with a moment of quiet genius in the Augustan age. In the bustling port city of Alexandria, around the year 10 BCE, a skilled artisan and inventor named Marcus Aelius begins to tinker with a radical idea. Marcus has long managed a workshop that produces metal seals and stamps for merchants, tools to mark amphora, sign documents, and imprint patterns into clay and wax. He is familiar with the concept of pressing an image onto a surface, and he knows the power of replication that a stamp affords. One day, as legend in this alternate timeline will have it, he observes workers at the dock applying inked seals to dozens of cargo lists in rapid succession. The thought strikes him. What if, instead of a whole seal for each document, one could compose any text from individual characters and reproduce it over and over? Marcus draws inspiration from the technology around him. He has seen screw presses at the olive mills outside the city, great wooden machines that, with a turn of the beam, can exert tremendous and even pressure. He has seen how a single engraved stamp can leave identical marks time and again. Combining these concepts, he imagines a device that could press many little stamps, letters, onto papyrus in one swift motion. Late at night in his lamplit workshop, he carves tiny Latin letters from hard olive wood. He fashions a flat bed and frame to hold these letters in sequence. Using a modified winepress, he constructs a mechanism to clamp the letters down onto a sheet of papyrus that has been brushed with soot-black ink. After weeks of trial and error, adjusting the pressure, experimenting with ink consistency, Marcus Aelius pulls the lever of his press and lifts the plate to find a clear block of text transferred to the papyrus below. For the first time in history, a page of text has been mechanically printed. This first crude printing press is a humble thing, a wooden frame prone to warping, wooden type that wears down after a few uses, an ink mixture borrowed from the soot of lamps and vegetable oil. It can imprint only a small page at a time. Yet the significance of Marcus's invention is immediately clear to him and a small circle of scholars who witness a demonstration. Where a scribe would spend hours copying a single page, the press produces an exact copy in minutes. With multiple sets of letters and a few presses running in tandem, hundreds of pages could be reproduced in the time it once took to hand copy one. At first, Marcus imagines his press as a curiosity or a tool for streamlining commerce, printing trade contracts or shipping manifests in quantity. But one of his confidants, an Alexandrian librarian steeped in learning, sees a far grander potential. She envisions the great works stored in the Library of Alexandria, the epics of Homer, the dialogues of Plato, the wisdom texts of Egypt and Babylon, duplicated easily and disseminated beyond the library's walls. Knowledge that has long been confined to fragile singular scrolls might be spread to scholars in every city of the empire. With excitement and trepidation, they realize that this machine could upend how knowledge is shared. News of the invention spreads slowly at first, by word of mouth and by letter. In Rome, it sounds like a rumor too fanciful to be true, a device that can copy texts mechanically. Yet the Augustan age is one of innovation and public works, and the idea finds a receptive audience in high places. By 7 BCE, an official summons brings Marcus Aelius from Alexandria to Rome, along with his peculiar press, to demonstrate the contraption before a panel of the emperor's advisors. In a quiet courtyard of the Palatine Hill under the dappled shade of laurel trees, Marcus arranges his letters and prints a short excerpt from Virgil's recently completed Aeneid. The onlookers, senators, scribes, and engineers, watch in astonishment as the verses appear replicated on the page with perfect fidelity. The feat is unmistakable. A new technology stands before them, one that could make copying texts not only faster, but standardized and uniform in a way never seen before. When word of the successful demonstration reaches Emperor Augustus, he is intrigued and wary in equal measure. Augustus is a shrewd guardian of Roman tradition and order, yet also a patron of the arts and an architect of Rome's future. He understands the power of the written word. After all, he has commissioned grand works like the Res Gestae, an account of his accomplishments to cement his legacy. The prospect of reproducing imperial edicts, propaganda, and literature swiftly across his vast empire is undeniably appealing. But Augustus also perceives the disruptive potential of this invention. Knowledge is power, and to multiply it is to multiply power, for good or ill. After careful deliberation, Augustus decides to cautiously embrace the printing press under the watchful eye of the state. Marcus Aelius is taken under imperial patronage, effectively making his invention the property of Rome. The emperor instructs that a limited number of presses be constructed and placed in the hands of trusted scribes and technicians within the imperial bureaucracy. Initially, the technology is to be a closely held secret, used to augment the production of official documents and literature deemed beneficial to Roman authority. Thus, with the quiet backing of the princeps, the first generation of Roman printing presses begins operation. In the final years of Augustus's reign, the city of Rome sees something entirely new. In a workshop adjacent to the imperial archives, the rhythmic clack of a press lever echoes as copies of decrees, legal codes, and perhaps a few favored poems are pressed onto papyrus, one after another. The age of printing has arrived, centuries ahead of its time, not with fanfare and upheaval, but with the measured, prudent introduction, orchestrated by Rome's first emperor. Imperial imprints. In the early years of the 1st century CE, Rome cautiously nurtures its revolutionary new tool. Under Emperor Augustus's careful guidance, the use of printing remains a privilege of the state and a select few. The first printed works are, by design, instruments of governance and culture that reinforce imperial ideals. In a dedicated workshop near the Roman Forum, scribes turned typesetters arrange wooden letters to print official decrees. Praetors and provincial governors receive multiple identical copies of new laws and tax edicts, each bearing the same authoritative words without copyist error. The impact is subtle but profound. Where once an edict might be miscopied or delayed, now uniform text arrives in far-flung provincial capitals, carrying the voice of Rome with unprecedented consistency. Administrative efficiency takes a modest but noticeable leap forward as the empire's bureaucracy begins to speak with one printed voice. Alongside laws and edicts, Augustus permits the printing of certain literary and cultural works that serve Rome's image. Selections of Virgil's Aeneid, which glorifies Rome's divine origins, are among the first non-official texts to roll off the press. These are distributed as finely made papyrus pamphlets to governors, generals, and educational elites, signaling the dawn of a new way to propagate Roman values. A poem that once would circulate slowly in hand-copied scrolls can now reach dozens of libraries and private collections within a year. Augustus's own Res Gestae, the inscription of his achievements he orders posted on temple walls, is quietly reproduced in pamphlet form as well, a kind of proto-newspaper that might be read aloud in the forum or copied by hand for those beyond the press's reach. The Roman people begin to encounter printed words in their daily lives, posted on public boards or read out by town criers who have received a sheet with news from Rome. To the average citizen, the change is almost invisible at first. After all, most Roman citizens, especially the lower classes, remain illiterate, and for them the written word has always been something heard more often than read. But among the educated classes, the reaction to printing oscillates between excitement and uncertainty. Scholars and librarians marvel at the potential to duplicate precious manuscripts. The great libraries in Rome, Alexandria, and Pergamon petition the imperial government for access to the presses to copy their holdings, eager to protect against the ever-present threat of fire or decay that haunts their collections. A few such projects are cautiously approved. In one case, several volumes of Aristotle's works in Greek are printed in Alexandria to create backup copies for the library at Rome's Temple of Apollo. In another, a collection of Roman law cases is printed and distributed to judges across Italy, an early step towards systematizing legal knowledge empire-wide. Meanwhile, the copyists and scribes, many of them educated slaves and freedmen who have long formed the backbone of the empire's record-keeping, face a period of adjustment. Initially, some bristle at the strange machine that threatens to upend their revered craft. These men and women have spent lifetimes honing the art of beautiful writing, and in the early prints, the uniform letters lack the personal touch of a scribe's hand. Rumors circulate in scholarly circles. Is the press producing soulless mechanical texts that will degrade the quality of literature? Will an army of unthinking machines replace the skilled scribes, much as mills replaced hand-grinding of grain? But such fears are tempered by reality. The demand for written material in the empire has always outstripped the supply. Far from rendering scribes obsolete, printing presses create even more work. Skilled scribes are hired as typesetters, proofreaders, and press operators, their literacy now employed to ensure the new printed texts are accurate and elegant. Over time, many come to appreciate that a printed text need not be impersonal. It can carry annotations, illuminated borders, and thoughtful layout guided by human hands. The imperial monopoly on printing holds through the reigns of Augustus and his successor, Tiberius. A strict oversight is maintained. Presses are to be operated only under license, and each sheet produced is accounted for. The content is limited to what the state deems appropriate, mostly governmental, educational, or prestigious literary works. The technology itself, however, cannot be kept entirely secret. Artisans who build and maintain the presses share whispers with their colleagues. A scholar who has seen a printed text marvels at its perfection and describes the process in letters to a friend. By the middle of the 1st century, curious experiments are underway beyond the direct control of Rome. In the Greek East, a resourceful printer in Athens, formerly employed in the imperial scriptorium, begins printing small booklets of Stoic philosophy to sell to students, skirting the edges of legality but finding a ready market. Similarly, in Antioch, a wealthy patron acquires knowledge of the technique and funds the printing of popular Greek comedies for local theatres, calling them festival copies to avoid suspicion. Such instances of unapproved printing remain rare and carefully hidden, but they mark the slow seep of the invention into the broader society. The Emperor Claudius, known for his scholarly inclinations, is said to have remarked upon discovering an unauthorized printed pamphlet in circulation that the black art of multiplication had escaped its cage. Recognizing that the genie cannot be kept in the bottle forever, Claudius and later Nero attempt to formalize control, issuing edicts that any new presses must be registered with the urban prefect, and any non-state use of printing must receive prior approval. These measures have limited success. By the end of the 1st century, perhaps 2 or 3 dozen printing presses operate across the empire, the majority still under official oversight, churning out an expanding array of materials: military handbooks for legion officers, standardized texts for schoolmasters to teach grammar and rhetoric, calendars and almanacs for city planners and farmers, and copies of classical works for the private libraries of the affluent. The Roman world is beginning to feel the first ripple of the printing revolution. Books and documents remain far from common commodities. The cost of papyrus and ink and the rarity of presses see to that. But where a library once boasted a single cherished copy of Livy's history, now it might have 5. A magistrate in Gaul can read the same printed digest of Roman law that a magistrate in Syria has, ensuring both govern with a shared understanding of legal precedent. A student in Cordoba might read a booklet of Seneca's philosophy identical to one in Athens. Through these identical pages runs a new thread binding the empire together. Under the gilded surface of the Pax Romana, a quiet transformation is underway. The quills of scribes still scratch, but alongside them, the rhythmic press is stamping out a growing chorus of identical texts. Rome has found a new voice in ink and wood, and though it speaks softly now, the echoes of that voice will only grow louder in the centuries to come. Knowledge unbound by the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire reaches the height of its power and geographic span, and with it, the influence of the printing press quietly expands as well. The age of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius is remembered as a golden era of peace, prosperity, and vigorous intellectual activity. In this timeline, it becomes an era when knowledge truly begins to unbind itself from the confines of singular manuscripts and exclusive institutions. The imperial printing presses, though still regulated, have multiplied in number and capability. Technical refinements gradually improve the process. Roman metallurgists experiment with casting bronze typefaces to replace delicate wooden letters, yielding more durable and precise text. Papyrus mills in Egypt, stimulated by rising demand, increase production, and entrepreneurs even toy with various substitutes, treated cloth or thin leather sheets, to supplement writing materials. There is talk in Alexandria of a strange new material from the distant land of Ceres, China. A smooth paper made not from reeds or hides, but from pounded mulberry bark and rags. Though true paper will not be locally produced for some time, the rumour itself spurs inventors to keep searching for ways to support the burgeoning book trade. Nowhere is the impact of these changes more evident than in the realm of education and scholarship. Across the empire's great cities, from Athens and Alexandria to Ephesus and Carthage, libraries swell with newly copied volumes. In Athens, the Library of Pantainos, historically modest, becomes a hub of learning after receiving dozens of printed copies of philosophical texts from the Alexandrian presses. Students in the Stoa can study the works of Aristotle or Epicurus without waiting for a precious scroll to be loaned. Multiple copies exist for simultaneous use. In Rome, the Platonist philosophers who gather at the Academy of Athenaeum find that every member can own a printed copy of Plato's Republic to reference during debates, an unimaginable luxury in earlier times. The effect is a subtle democratization within the elite intellectual sphere. Knowledge is still limited to those educated in letters, but among them, it is less of a zero-sum game. Texts no longer vanish into private collections as rarities. They circulate and recirculate. This wider availability of text begins to accelerate intellectual cross-pollination. A doctor in Pergamon, for instance, can obtain a printed compendium of Hippocrates' medical teachings and the latest treatises of the Roman physician Galen soon after Galen writes them. Indeed, Galen himself, serving in Rome around 170 CE, takes advantage of the presses to disseminate his works on anatomy and pharmacology to far-flung medical schools. From Alexandria's Temple of Serapis, famous for medicine, to distant Aquileia on the northern frontier. For the first time, a standard corpus of medical knowledge spreads through the empire within a single generation, creating a shared foundation for healing practices. Young physicians studying in different cities read identical texts on anatomy, which leads to more consistent treatments and encourages collaborative refinement of techniques through correspondence. In a similar vein, the geographer and astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, working in Alexandria circa 150 CE, is able to have his great work, the Mathematique Syntaxis, known later as the Almagest, printed in Greek. Only a limited number of copies are produced, but these reach observatories and scholarly circles in Antioch, Athens, and Rome within a decade. Scholars separated by hundreds of miles can pore over Ptolemy's star catalogues and geometric models of the heavens, comparing notes and verifying his calculations against their own observations. The result is an early, rudimentary form of a scientific community. a republic of letters bound together by a common set of printed reference works. As practical knowledge spreads, subtle technological improvements follow. Roman engineers find inspiration in the circulated works of their predecessors. Vitruvius's 10 books on architecture, printed anew under Hadrian's patronage, become a handbook for ambitious builders across the empire, influencing designs of aqueducts, amphitheatres, and domes by standardizing best practices. An engineer in Gaul might consult a copy of Hero of Alexandria's treatises on mechanics and pneumatics, works that, in our original timeline, were largely forgotten in the West until much later. In this alternate timeline, Hero's descriptions of steam-powered devices, like his eolipile, automated machinery, and water pumps are more widely known. While the Romans do not leap into an industrial revolution, their society still anchored in traditional labor and powered by muscle, water, and wind. Individual tinkerers and thinkers experiment more boldly, armed with knowledge recorded in printed guides. We hear of a smith in Roman Gaul who, inspired by Hero's inventions, devises an improved watermill with a gear mechanism described in a printed pamphlet, of a fleet engineer in Ravenna who uses a printed manual of ship designs to standardize the construction of warships, of surveyors in North Africa exchanging printed diagrams of new irrigation devices to better tame the waters of the Nile and Euphrates. The sharing of technical diagrams is a new frontier. Presses begin to include woodcut illustrations carved by artisans to accompany text. Although crude, these printed images allow architects and craftsmen to replicate complex designs more faithfully. With knowledge flowing more freely, the culture of debate and discourse also deepens. In Rome, the Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius in the 170s can read the works of his philosophical forebears not from a single cherished scroll, but from a printed anthology of Stoic writings. This surely influences his own meditations, which, in another twist of fate, do not languish in obscurity as private journals. Instead, after his death, sympathetic scholars compile and print excerpts of Marcus's reflections on virtue, duty, and the transience of life. These meditations copies circulate among the literati of the late 2nd century, making Marcus Aurelius something of a philosopher king, whose ideas live on in print to guide future generations. Likewise, the dissenting voices in philosophy find more platforms. Epicurean texts, often suppressed by more traditional Romans for their challenge to piety, find their way into print runs by intellectual patrons in cities like Athens, where local authorities are more tolerant of heterodox ideas. Thus, even minority philosophies and knowledge that might have been lost, say, Lucretius's great poem on the nature of things expounding atomist theory, survive and gain readers through limited printings for scholarly circles. In this way, the diversity of thought in the Roman world widens. There is more room for skepticism, for inquiry into natural phenomena, for preserved knowledge that might have otherwise perished. Still, these advances touch only a sliver of Roman society directly. The world of print remains mostly the world of the educated elite. Senators, scholars, high-ranking bureaucrats, and wealthy merchants. But indirect effects begin to filter down. Because texts are more available, teachers in urban schools can acquire standard textbooks to teach grammar, rhetoric, and basic sciences. As a result, some middle-class children, the sons and a few daughters of merchants, artisans, and centurions given retirement lands, receive a more uniform and higher quality education. Literacy, while still not universal by any means, creeps upward in urban centres. A trader who once might have remained illiterate now has greater incentive to learn to read, since price lists, shipping schedules, or trade tariffs might be posted in print at the forum. An artisan with ambition might teach himself geometry from a printed booklet to improve his craft. These are small ripples, but over generations they accumulate, contributing to a slowly broadening base of literate Romans. Thus, as the 2nd century draws to a close, the Roman Empire stands not only at an apex of territorial and economic might, but at the cusp of a nascent information revolution. No fanfare heralds this transformation among the masses, but in quiet studies and libraries, in workshops and schools, the knowledge of the ancients is being replicated and preserved at an unprecedented scale. A foundation is being laid, unknowingly, for resilience against the forgetfulness of time. The Romans have lit a lamp against the darkness. They cannot yet see how far its light will reach, but future centuries will find in their printed pages a torch passed hand to hand, illuminating the path through ages of turmoil to come. Faith in print, even as knowledge and administration are transformed by printing. The spiritual currents of the Roman world are undergoing their own profound change. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the empire's religious landscape is pluralistic. Traditional Roman gods are worshipped in grand temples. Mystery cults from the East attract devotees with promise of salvation, and a small, persecuted sect of followers of Jesus of Nazareth quietly spreads a new faith across cities and trade routes. The rise of Christianity in our timeline was slow and fitful, aided by letters painstakingly copied and gospels shared in secret. In this alternate timeline, the existence of the printing press introduces a subtle but significant new factor into the spread of religion. In the earliest decades of Christianity, the mid-1st century, the faith is too marginal and the imperial press is too tightly controlled for there to be any possibility of printing Christian texts openly. The apostles and their disciples still pass around hand-copied letters and manuscripts. However, there are whispers that one of the first breaches of the imperial printing monopoly came at the hands of a sympathetic artisan in Antioch around 100 CE. According to later Christian tradition, this unnamed typesetter, impressed by the courage of local Christians and intrigued by their message of universal salvation, used a small, covert press to produce a handful of pamphlets containing excerpts of the Gospel of Mark and some sayings of Jesus. These were distributed among the Christian communities of Syria, allowing congregations separated by distance to share a consistent written teaching. If the tale is true, it represents the first instance of samizdat, underground printing, being used in the service of faith. The Roman authorities, ever vigilant against subversion, catch rumors of such activities. Sporadic persecutions of Christians in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries occasionally involve efforts to seize and destroy their writings. In this timeline, those efforts are more complicated. A cache of illicitly printed Christian texts might distribute identical copies to dozens of converts before imperial agents can confiscate them. When Emperor Diocletian unleashes the Great Persecution in 303 CE, his edict includes an order to burn Christian books. In our original timeline, many precious manuscripts were lost this way. In the alternate timeline, while many hand-copied scrolls and codices are consigned to flames, the existence of even a few printing presses in hiding means the words spring up again, like seeds after a fire. A small workshop in Alexandria run by Christian converts manages to print portions of the Psalms and the New Testament in the Coptic language of Egypt, sustaining the faithful in that region despite official repression. The true marriage of printing and Christianity, however, comes after the persecution ends. When Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity and issues the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, granting religious tolerance, the once forbidden faith swiftly moves from the shadows into public life. Now, at last, the powerful tools of mass reproduction can be wielded openly in religion's cause. Constantine, pragmatic and visionary, immediately sees an opportunity to use the printing press to forge unity in the newly Christian empire. He commissions 50 complete copies of the Holy Scriptures for the Church of Constantinople, as he did in our timeline, but here the method is printing rather than hundreds of scribes. In a scriptorium-turned printing house in Antioch, teams of workers set movable Greek type to the pages of what will become some of the first printed Bibles. Though labor-intensive, each copy still taking months to assemble and bind. This task would have been impossible to fulfill so quickly by hand. The result, by the time of the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, dozens of identical Bibles exist, ensuring that the bishops from various corners of the empire can literally be on the same page as they debate doctrine. During the Council of Nicaea, as bishops clash over the nature of Christ, printing becomes an unexpected player in the proceedings. When the council produces its creed condemning Arianism and affirming the co-equal divinity of the Son with the Father, copies of the Nicene Creed are printed on site and sent with each delegation to take back home. Never before has an official doctrinal statement been so rapidly and uniformly disseminated. This speedy communication helps orthodoxy take root, but it also spurs the Arians to leverage the same technology. Within months, pro-Arian clergy in some eastern cities circulate printed pamphlets offering scriptural evidence for their interpretation, rallying support even as imperial authority condemns their teachings. Theological debate, which once spread at the speed of hand-copied letters, now travels with the swiftness of the imperial post, amplified by print. Controversies that might have taken generations to percolate now unfold over mere years, engaging not just bishops but lay readers who can get access to these documents if they are literate. Other Christian sects and movements likewise find voice. In North Africa, the Donatists, who reject what they see as impure, state-aligned bishops, spurn the imperial presses as corrupted and insist on hand-copying their favoured texts, seeing the newfangled printing as a tool of an unholy church-state complex. Their refusal ironically limits their reach, and over time many Donatist communities dwindle. Meanwhile, mainstream church leaders wholeheartedly embrace print as a means of standardizing worship. By the late 4th century, one can find printed hymnals and liturgical calendars in major churches. St. Augustan of Hippo, a towering figure in theology, watches copies of his works Confessions and City of God, printed and sent to Christians in Italy and Gaul during his own lifetime, amplifying his influence. Augustine, ever mindful of truth and error, even writes in one letter about the need to check printed copies for typos and mistakes introduced by careless typesetters, a new sort of concern for a new era. By the latter half of the 4th century, the foundational writings of the Church Fathers were circulating in quantity. The eloquent sermons of St. Basil of Caesarea, the theological epistles of St. Jerome, the apologetic defenses by early thinkers like Origen and Tertullian, all had been set in type and duplicated, supplying bishops' libraries and monastic schools from Anatolia to Gaul. This meant a student in one corner of the empire could study the same Greek homilies or Latin discourses as his counterpart on the opposite frontier. Debates that once would have been local now echoed across Christendom. A controversy sparked by a printed tract in Alexandria might be answered by a bishop in Hispania weeks later through his own printed letter, with dozens of copies fanning out to interested parties. In this way, Christian doctrine developed not only in councils, but in a continuous exchange on paper, knitting together a universal church through a common intellectual currency. Judaism, too, is touched by the advent of printing, though in a different manner. The Jews of the Empire and Persia hold their scriptures, the Torah and other Hebrew books, in deep reverence and are initially hesitant to adopt mechanical reproduction for sacred texts. Through the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Torah scrolls continue to be copied by hand under rabbinic supervision as required by religious law. However, other texts, like philosophical writings by Hellenistic Jewish authors or Aramaic translations and commentaries, targums, quietly begin to circulate in printed form among the educated Jewish diaspora. By the 4th century, some pragmatic rabbis permit the printing of the voluminous Talmudic commentaries that are emerging, reasoning that the press can aid scholars in preserving oral law in writing across far-flung communities. In secret, perhaps at a press in Alexandria or Sepphoris, portions of the Mishnah and Talmud are printed in small runs for rabbinical academies, easing the burden of hand-copying these complex discussions and ensuring consistency in study. As the Western Roman Empire wanes in the 5th century, Christianity stands as the dominant faith in that half of the world, and the Church increasingly becomes the steward of knowledge. The printing presses of Rome, Milan, and Carthage, once instruments of empire, gradually fall under the Church's purview as secular authorities weaken. In these turbulent times, the ability to produce multiple copies of correspondence and decrees helps the bishops of Rome, Carthage, and Constantinople maintain a semblance of organizational cohesion. Papal encyclicals and theological treatises can be reproduced and sent to far-off monasteries and churches, spreading a unified Christian doctrine and practice even as political unity crumbles. By the time the last Western emperor abdicates in 476 CE, a new infrastructure of spiritual cohesion exists. An educated clergy equipped with scripture and teachings in consistent form, monasteries beginning to house presses that will preserve not only Holy Writ, but also any other learning they can gather, and a populace for whom the written and printed Word of God has a growing aura of sacred authority. Thus, printing leaves an indelible mark on the religious evolution of late antiquity. It spreads the Christian message further and faster once the initial dam of persecution breaks. It preserves doctrinal unity to an extent, yet also ensures that when schisms occur, the rival sides can entrench themselves with their own printed texts. It aids the Church in stepping into the power vacuum left by a disintegrating empire, by giving it the tools to administer, teach, and inspire across great distances. And it plants a seed that will lie dormant among the laity for now, the seed of direct access to scriptures, which in centuries to come, as literacy rises, could challenge the very mediators who now propagate the faith. In the meantime, as the classical world gives way to the medieval, the press that once served Caesar now serves God, helping to carry ancient wisdom and a new gospel alike through the gathering twilight of Rome's worldly glory. Crisis and transformation. The 3rd century brings a storm that tests the resilience of Rome and its innovations. As in our original timeline, this period sees the empire plunged into crisis, a rapid turnover of emperors, barbarian incursions on every border, economic turmoil, and plagues. Communication and unity are critical as never before. In this alternate timeline, the printing press becomes both a tool and a weapon in the struggle to hold the empire together, and, paradoxically, a means by which challengers to imperial power spread their claims. During the crisis of the 3rd century, 235–284 CE, rival generals, each proclaiming themselves emperor, erupt across the provinces. The legitimacy of an emperor often rests on how quickly and widely he can communicate his ascension and win loyalty. Now, the news of a new emperor in, say, Gaul can be printed in broadsheet form and posted in the marketplaces of Lyon and Trier within days of his acclamation, complete with stirring slogans and official-looking seals reproduced by woodcut. In Rome, the sitting emperor's bureaucracy counters by printing edicts declaring the usurper a rebel and promising rewards for those who remain loyal. For the first time, the empire is awash in competing propaganda by print. A particularly ambitious pretender in the East, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who carves out her own dominion during the 270s, famously prints a manifesto in Greek and Latin, justifying her rule as the protector of the eastern provinces. Copies of her proclamation appear in the streets of Antioch and Alexandria almost overnight, undermining the credibility of the distant emperor in Rome. This battle of words mirrors the clash of legions. And though it cannot by itself secure victory, it accelerates the swing of public sentiment. Authority in this age becomes as much about controlling information as controlling armies. The central government still tries to harness printing to preserve unity. Emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian, who eventually restore a semblance of order, use their access to the official presses to saturate the empire with decrees that emphasize loyalty and the restoration of Roman glory. Diocletian's sweeping economic edict, the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, is printed in large quantities and distributed to every province in multiple copies, a logistical feat that only printing could manage. But even this has unintended consequences. When the edict's harsh price controls lead to shortages and discontent, the very efficiency of its distribution ensures that resentment is synchronized across cities. People see the imperial edict nailed in forums and blame the distant bureaucracy for their woes. As the empire strains under external pressures, printing technology slips increasingly into non-Roman hands. The once secret art has, over 2 centuries, gradually diffused. In 251 CE, after the Gothic victory at the Battle of Abritus, Gothic warriors loot the Balkan cities, and among the treasures taken is said to be a compact printing apparatus from a provincial archive. While the Goths initially have no use for the strange device, captive Roman scribes among them do. By the time peace is made, rumors spread that the Gothic king Cniva possessed printed guides, perhaps produced by captive craftsmen, advising him of Roman roads and fortress layouts. True or not, within a generation, the Gothic tribes have leaders who grasp the power of the written word. In 311 CE, the Visigothic chieftain Atholf, during uneasy alliance with Rome, requests a Latin priest to print a copy of the Codex Theodosianus, the Roman law code, for him, ostensibly to better govern his followers under Roman law. Through such means, the seeds of Roman literacy and printing find soil even among those who will eventually dismantle the Western Empire. In the mid-4th century, one remarkable figure leverages printing to bridge cultures. The Gothic bishop Ulfilas Wulfila devises a written Gothic alphabet and translates the Bible for his people. In this alternate history, Ulfilas's monumental effort is aided by printing. He collaborates with Eastern Roman printers in Constantinople to produce multiple copies of the Gothic Bible, which are then carried north of the Danube. Consequently, entire Gothic communities gain access to Scripture in their own tongue, strengthening both their Arian Christian faith and their literary tradition. These printed Bibles will travel with them as they eventually migrate into Roman lands, providing a cultural cohesion that in our timeline was sustained only by oral transmission and a few handwritten codices. As the 4th century wanes, the Western Empire buckles under the weight of constant war and political fragmentation. Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Huns carve away at its territories. The sack of Rome by the Visigoth king Alaric in 410 CE, a symbolic shock in any timeline, has an added dimension here. Among the treasures Alaric seizes are not only gold and silver, but also the contents of Rome's imperial workshops. Chroniclers later recount that the Goths carried off presses and letters, along with scholars from the city. In the following decades, these captives and devices are put to use in the Visigothic kingdom of Gaul and Spain. Alaric's successors realized that to govern Roman subjects and claim legitimacy, they must issue laws and tax orders in Latin as the emperors did. They used the captured presses to print proclamations, styling themselves as heirs to Roman authority, even as they dismember the empire. On a twilight evening in August 410, as Rome falls to Alaric's army, a small band of Roman scholars huddle in a wing of the nearly deserted Palatine Library. Through an open colonnade, they can see distant fires flickering across the city. One elderly scribe, Cassius, gently closes a leather-bound codex of Livy's histories that he had been typesetting on a portable press. He and his apprentices have spent frantic hours printing whatever texts they can, knowing the end is at hand. In the courtyard lies their prized wooden press, dismantled into pieces for transport. Cassius murmurs a prayer to Minerva and to the Christian god alike, then directs the younger men to load the press's components and a trunk of freshly printed manuscripts onto a mule cart. As the sounds of barbarian shouts draw nearer, the scholars slip into the alleys of Rome, determined to save what knowledge they can. One apprentice, scarcely 16, clutches a bundle of Virgil's verses he saved at great personal risk. As they urge the mule onward through Rome's dark alleys, Cassius looks back to see the capital's silhouette against flames and whispers, "We carry Rome's soul with us." By dawn, they will be on the Appian Way, joining the stream of refugees. Unbeknownst to Cassius, the Visigothic king himself will soon value those printing skills. But in this moment, the old Roman simply clings to the hope that these words of the past will survive to illuminate a dark future. Meanwhile, far to the east, a new power benefits from Roman know-how. The Sasanian Persian Empire, long Rome's rival, has watched the development of printing with interest. By the late 4th century, Persian scholars in Gundashapur, an academic city where Greek and Indian knowledge mingles, have learned the basics of woodblock printing from Roman prisoners or refugees. Though they never adopted the Latin-style movable type during this time, they begin experimenting with engraved woodblocks to reproduce short texts, particularly the Zend Avesta, Zoroastrian scriptures, and astronomical tables. Thus, the concept of mass-produced text is starting to take root beyond Rome's borders as well, setting the stage for an even wider spread of information technology. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE is a slow fizzle rather than a single event. Roman institutions erode as the Germanic warlords divide the spoils. Yet even in this twilight, printing plays a crucial role in preserving a sense of continuity. In the Kingdom of Italy, the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, who governs after 493 CE, takes pride in being a custodian of Roman civilization. Advisors like the philosopher Boethius and the statesman Cassiodorus serve at his court, where the remaining presses of Ravenna and Rome are put to use, copying both Christian and classical works. Boethius himself, determined to transmit the wisdom of Greece and Rome to future generations, oversees printed editions of some of Aristotle's logical treatises, with his own commentaries. An effort that in our timeline resulted in a few precious manuscripts, but here can produce dozens of copies that find their way into the libraries of monasteries and scholars across Italy and Gaul. Cassiodorus, retiring to found a monastic academy at Vivarium, similarly ensures that presses accompany the scribes he sets to preserving all the knowledge they can. The printed word becomes the lifeboat of a sinking world. Laws, philosophies, scriptures, and histories are multiplied and sent to safe harbours in monasteries and episcopal libraries before the lights go out in the Roman West. By 500 CE, Western Europe is a patchwork of barbarian kingdoms atop the ruins of Roman governance. Yet unlike in our timeline's darkening age, these kingdoms inherit a robust Christian church and a body of literature not confined to a few elite centres, but replicated across many locales. Bishops and warlords alike possess printed law codes and liturgical books. Some royal courts keep a printer among their retinue to issue decrees in Latin to their subjects. The Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople, still stands and remains a beacon of learning, its workshops continuing to print in Greek and Latin, supplying the Eastern Christian world with books and bureaucratic paperwork. While the West rebuilds under new rulers, the East uses print to cement its own identity. Emperor Justinian in the 6th century will order an updated compilation of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, and have it printed in both Constantinople and Antioch, ensuring that even as Latin fades in the East, its legal heritage is preserved uniformly. The Roman Empire's political unity may have shattered, but the intellectual and spiritual unity forged in part by the printing press endures. Ideas and knowledge cross the borders of post-Roman kingdoms with greater ease now. A monk in Ireland, at the far edge of the known world, might possess a printed copy of St. Jerome's Vulgate Bible or Augustine's City of God brought by travellers. A Visigothic noble educates his son using a printed set of Latin grammars and classic texts salvaged from a Gallo-Roman library. A Frankish bishop corresponding with the Pope can receive duplicate letters thanks to a Roman scriptorium in Gaul that prints important correspondence for archiving and dissemination. The collapse of empire, in short, does not plunge Europe into intellectual darkness as deeply as it might have. The sparks of Roman learning are scattered, yes, but they are scattered as embers across a wider area, glowing in monasteries, courts, and churches, waiting to ignite the new dawn of the medieval world. The lamp in the Dark Ages, in the centuries after Rome's fall in the West, the flame of knowledge, kept alive by the printing press, continues to flicker throughout Europe and beyond. What our timeline remembers as the Dark Ages are in this alternate world, markedly brighter in the glow of preserved and circulating texts. The infrastructure of learning and faith built in late antiquity proves resilient. Monasteries, those bastions of literacy, become the new workshops of print. By the 6th and 7th centuries, many major monastic centres, Monte Cassino in Italy, Vivarium, founded by Cassiodorus, and the island monastery of Iona off Scotland, have acquired or improvised simple printing presses. Monks still illuminate manuscripts by hand as acts of devotion, but for daily use and distribution, they print multiple copies of scriptures, prayer books, and the writings of church fathers. The Rule of Saint Benedict, for example, is printed and disseminated to far-flung monasteries, ensuring that a common standard guides monastic life from Italy to the Frankish realms to Anglo-Saxon England. This means that the spiritual and educational network of the Church operates with shared texts and norms to a degree impossible in a manuscript-only culture. Even in far-flung Britannia, abandoned by Roman legions in the early 5th century, the legacy of print endured. Aristocratic villas in Britain had acquired presses and libraries during better days, and when central authority collapsed, some of this equipment passed into the hands of local monks and chieftains. In the centuries that followed, Celtic monasteries in places like Wales and Ireland safeguarded not only manuscripts but also a few aging presses, using them to continue copying Latin texts even as new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rose amid the ruins. This meant that when Christian missionaries later returned to reconvert England, they found pockets of Roman knowledge, grammars, scriptures, even a smattering of Virgil's verses, miraculously alive and waiting to reawaken the island's cultural memory. The early medieval missionary efforts also benefit. When Pope Gregory the Great sends Augustan of Canterbury to convert the Anglo-Saxons in 597 CE, the mission carries not only faith and holy zeal, but also a chest of printed materials. Among them are printed Latin gospel books and liturgical guides, sturdy enough to survive the journey and numerous enough to leave copies with new congregations. As a result, the fledgling English church has immediate access to core texts without needing years to copy them. In the same period, Irish monasteries, famous in our history for laboriously copying books by hand, take readily to printing once they learn of it through contact with the continent. By the 7th century, the scriptorium at Clonmacnoise in Ireland boasts a press turning out copies of the Psalms and scholarly works, which Irish monks then carry back to continental Europe as they did in our timeline, but now with panniers of printed books. The effect is a tighter weave in the fabric of European Christianity and learning. No longer is knowledge confined to a few lucky libraries. Redundancy is built in by the very nature of print. A Viking raid might sack one monastery library, but identical copies of its most valued texts exist in dozens of other sanctuaries across Europe. In the East, the Byzantine Empire endures as a bastion of classical culture. Byzantium maintains a sophisticated state apparatus, which includes state-run printing workshops in Constantinople. By the 6th century, Emperor Justinian's reign sees the printing of his famous law code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, not only in Latin for lawyers, but with Greek summaries for officials, distributed throughout the Eastern Empire. This helps ensure a uniform legal culture even as the empire's language shifts fully to Greek. Byzantine scholars continue to engage with ancient Greek literature. Works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen are reprinted in Alexandria and Constantinople to supply the academies of Athens until its closure. Alexandria and Antioch. The debates of the iconoclast controversy, the 8th–9th century conflict over religious images, are fought not just in council chambers, but in pamphlets. Iconoclast emperors have theological treatises against icons printed and posted in cities, while iconodule monks counter by secretly printing tracts in favor of the holy images. Though the state tries to control the narrative, the printing press makes it harder to silence opposition entirely. By the time the controversy resolves, the Byzantines have a vibrant, if contentious, intellectual life, with printing as a norm for disseminating imperial edicts and theological arguments alike. To the south and east, a new power emerges. The Islamic Caliphate spreads rapidly in the 7th and 8th centuries, conquering lands that include the old centers of Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage, all places where printing presses were known. Early Muslim governors in these regions inherit workshops and perhaps local printers among the subdued populations. At first, the utility of printing to the Caliphate is limited. Arabic script, with its cursive forms, is less immediately suited to the existing Latin letterpress technology. Moreover, religious conservatism makes some officials wary. The Quran is considered holy text whose every copy must be exactingly transcribed, yet necessity drives innovation. By the Abbasid era, 8th and 9th centuries, the Caliphate's bureaucracy is immense, and some pragmatic viziers experiment with printing simple administrative forms and tax records using woodblock printing, carving entire pages, adapted from knowledge gleaned in Egypt and Persia. In time, the scholars of the Baghdad House of Wisdom, that great center of translation and learning, see potential in printing to aid their projects. Around 850 CE, it is recorded that mathematicians at the House of Wisdom printed multiple copies of astronomical tables, Zij, to distribute to observatories from Cordoba to Samarkand, accelerating the Islamic Golden Age's scientific collaboration. This is mostly block printing, not the sophisticated movable type of the Romans, but it marks the incorporation of printing into the broader Afro-Eurasian world. Ideas from Greek medical or philosophical texts, translated into Arabic and maybe reprinted in small runs, traverse the Caliphate more quickly, meaning when European scholars later seek these works, they find them not in single manuscript exemplars, but occasionally in packets of identical copies in the libraries of Toledo or Cairo. Back in Europe, the 8th and 9th centuries usher in a revival of arts and learning under Charlemagne and his successors, an era known in our world as the Carolingian Renaissance. In this alternate timeline, the Carolingian court at Aachen becomes a center of printing as well. Charlemagne, determined to reform education and religion in his kingdom, commissions the printing of a standardized Latin Vulgate Bible and a collection of corrected liturgical texts so that worship is uniform across his realm. The scholar Alcuin of York, who leads the palace school, oversees production of printed textbooks, grammars, histories, and simple arithmetic tables that can be sent to every cathedral and monastic school established by Charlemagne's decree. The new Carolingian minuscule script, a clear form of writing Alcuin develops, is quickly adapted into typefaces for printing, replacing the mix of older styles with a legible common letter form across Frankish Europe. This dramatically reduces copying errors and makes learning materials more accessible to novices. By the time of Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 CE, an entire generation of clergy and administrators in Francia has been educated with identical texts, a uniform curriculum of sorts that lays groundwork for a more literate society. The effects are visible. More priests can preach directly from printed homiliaries, sermons, instead of improvising. More officials can reference the same capitularies, royal laws, printed and distributed to local courts. More chroniclers have at their fingertips printed annals and histories that give them a sense of a shared Frankish and Christian past. Late one winter night in the scriptorium of Monte Cassino, c. 580 CE, a lone monk named Brother Paulus tends to the printing press by flickering lamplight. Outside, an icy rain beats against the monastery walls, but inside, the air is filled with the steady clack of the press platen and the smell of ink. Brother Paulus carefully lifts a fresh page from the press. It is a leaf from St. Augustine's City of God, newly printed in clear Latin type. He whispers a prayer of thanks. Such a page would have taken days to copy by hand, yet here dozens can be made before matins. On the floor, drying on racks, are sheets of scripture destined for far-off abbeys in Gaul and Hispania, each carrying the same faithful text. The aging abbot watches from a doorway, marvelling at how far the preservation of sacred knowledge has come. From the cloister below comes the faint sound of a midnight hymn. Elsewhere, an owl hoots, answered by the shuffle of parchment, as another monk checks the fresh pages for errors. Where once he supervised weary scribes, now he oversees this wondrous device multiplying the word for generations unborn. In that dim lamp glow, amidst humming presses and illuminated letters, the so-called Dark Age reveals its hidden light. With knowledge more plentiful, hints of innovation glimmer. In the 10th century, Gerbert of Aurillac, a brilliant Frankish abbot who would later become Pope Sylvester II, studies mathematics and astronomy. In our history, he struggled to obtain rare manuscripts of Arabic learning. In the alternate timeline, he finds printed translations of those Arabic works, maybe from the libraries of Moorish Spain or from a monastery in Provence trading with Italy, at his disposal. He correspondingly advances the use of the abacus and armillary sphere, and even writes treatises of his own, which are printed and circulated among Europe's intellectual circles, small as they still are. We also hear of Viking Northmen, after settling in Christianized Normandy, encountering printing for the first time. One saga tells of a Norse chieftain who converted and took the hammer to the press to print a proclamation in the Norse tongue, likely apocryphal, but indicative of how the wonder of printing entered even barbarian lore. By the turn of the first millennium, circa 1000 CE, the Western world is still politically fragmented, and much remains to be rebuilt to the levels of Roman urbanity and complexity. Yet, unlike in our timeline, the intellectual underpinnings are relatively strong and growing. Latin remains the lingua franca of scholars and churchmen, and thanks to the printing press, the Latin texts they study in England, France, Germany, or Italy are virtually identical, maintaining a coherence in intellectual life. The libraries of this medieval Europe hold vastly more volumes than their counterparts in our history did at that date. The works of antiquity, Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Livy, even the more technical texts of Pliny or Aristotle, have survived in dozens of copies and are increasingly studied by the curious. There is no need to wait, as Renaissance humanists did, for lucky rediscoveries in monastic basements. The classics have been there all along, quietly informing medieval minds that cared to read them. Crucially, too, the idea of progress, that one might build upon the knowledge of the ancients, is easier to conceive when those ancient voices are readily at hand in print. The lamp of learning, far from extinguished, burns steadily through the medieval night, lighting the way for the dawn of new achievements yet to come. Renaissance of knowledge by the High Middle Ages, 11th down to 13th centuries, the long-term effects of centuries of printing are unmistakable. Europe is still a patchwork of feudal states and warring kingdoms, but intellectual life is stirring as never before. The first universities crystallize in the late 11th and 12th centuries: Bologna, Paris, Oxford. And unlike in our timeline, they are founded in a world already accustomed to mass-produced books. At the University of Bologna, students of law no longer have to crowd around a single precious manuscript of Justinian's Digest. Instead, they can each acquire a printed copy of the legal texts, albeit still expensive, to study and annotate. Professors distribute printed lecture notes, establishing a standardized curriculum. In Paris, theology masters ensure every student of Scripture reads the same edition of the Bible and commentaries, eliminating the variations that once perplexed scholars comparing hand-copied texts. The presence of multiple copies of Aristotle's works, many translated from Greek and Arabic, ignites a revolution in philosophy. Scholastic thinkers like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas can reference identical texts as they argue and correspond across countries. When Aquinas writes his Summa Theologica in the 13th century, printing presses at the University of Paris and in Italian monasteries produce copies almost as fast as his chapters are completed, spreading his synthesis of faith and reason across Europe within a decade rather than a century. The result is a continent-wide scholarly discourse, a true republic of letters emerging well before the Enlightenment era of our timeline. With scholarly exchange accelerated, innovation in various fields gathers pace. The 12th century Renaissance, a term historians use in our timeline for a revival of classical learning, is deeper and broader here. By that time, virtually all surviving ancient Greek and Latin works on philosophy, science and literature have been printed at least once. Homer's epics, Plato's dialogues, Aristotle's treatises, Euclid's geometry, Archimedes' mathematics, Galen's medical writings, the plays of Sophocles and Seneca, the histories of Herodotus and Tacitus. You name it, ensuring that scholars everywhere can draw on the same wellspring of ideas. Translation movements flourish. In Spain and Sicily, where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars meet, the influx of Arabic and Greek knowledge, astronomy, algebra, medicine is swiftly translated into Latin and then printed for distribution. Gerardo of Cremona, for example, who historically translated dozens of works in Toledo by hand in the 12th century, can in this timeline oversee teams that set movable type to his Latin translations of Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra or Ptolemy's Almagest. Within a few years, these texts find their way into the toolkits of scholars in Paris, Oxford, and Prague. The diffusion of technical knowledge on astronomy, optics, or engineering feeds practical advances. By the 13th century, the design for improved windmills, a new system of double-entry bookkeeping from Lombardy, or an Arab treatise on navigational instruments can all be found in printed pamphlets circulating among Europe's nascent professional classes. Literacy, while still not universal, has broadened beyond the clergy. The mercantile republics of Italy, like Venice and Florence, boast a wealthy middle class that values education. Many merchant families now ensure their sons, and some daughters in enlightened cities like Bologna, learn to read and write, not just in Latin, but increasingly in the local vernacular. As vernacular literatures bloom, printing presses begin to turn their attention to these languages spoken by the people. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a cultural shift occurs. The works of great poets and storytellers are set in type. When Dante Alighieri pens his Divina Commedia around 1308, he writes in Tuscan Italian to reach a broad audience. Within his lifetime, copies of the Inferno are printed in Florence and Verona, making Dante a renowned figure far beyond his native city. Similarly, in England, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, late 14th century, is printed in Middle English soon after its composition, allowing his sly and humane stories to delight readers in London, York, and beyond, rather than remaining accessible only to those at court. The immediate printing of such works amplifies their impact and elevates vernacular languages to literary stature faster. As a result, by 1400, Europe's emerging national cultures, Italian, French, English, Castilian, already have a corpus of printed literature, fostering identity and cross-pollination of ideas in the common tongues. Not solely in Latin, the proliferation of books spurs the growth of libraries and the book trade as independent spheres outside church or university control. Urban centres like Paris, Venice, and Cologne see the rise of commercial print shops by the 14th century, operated by skilled artisans who have broken away from monastic supervision. These shops produce everything from cheap pamphlets of popular ballads and almanacs to fine editions of ancient classics for collectors. A guild of printers forms in Mainz as early as the 1200s, spreading technical improvements and negotiating rights and privileges with city authorities. With this commercialization, the cost of books slowly begins to drop, bringing them within reach of not just nobles and clerics, but also prosperous burghers. By 1400, a moderately successful merchant might own a small personal library of a few dozen printed books. Perhaps a Bible, a medical guide, some classics, and astrological calendars, a scenario unimaginable a few centuries prior. Not only did printing elevate the written word, it also transformed other arts and sciences. By the 16th century, printers had adapted their presses to reproduce musical notation, allowing the compositions of a Flemish polyphonist or an Italian madrigalist to be printed and shared among choirs and courts across Europe. The result was a much quicker spread of musical styles. A village organist in Germany could perform a mass by Palestrina only a few years after it was composed in Rome, having obtained a printed songbook. Visual art, too, found a partner in print. Artists like Albrecht Dürer carved woodcuts and engravings that printers reproduced in large numbers, flooding Europe with iconic images and inspiring local artists who could study these works without ever traveling to see the originals. This diffusion of artistic and musical ideas helped create a more unified cultural renaissance. A painter in Poland might practice Italian perspective techniques learned from a printed manual, while a peasant girl in Spain hums a tune from a far-off land, taught to her from a printed broadside of folk songs. High culture and folk culture alike are enriched and intertwined by the press's reach. Armed with abundant knowledge and a growing sense of confidence, European thinkers begin to question old dogmas and explore new horizons in the late medieval period. Roger Bacon, a 13th century English friar, advocates empirical observation and experiments. In this timeline, his ideas find a receptive audience beyond his monastery, because his treatises on optics and experimental science are printed and debated by scholars in multiple countries. Though the church authorities still eye unorthodox ideas with suspicion, they are fighting a more diffuse battle. No longer can the condemnation of a single manuscript silence an idea when dozens of copies circulate widely. The seeds of humanism, an outlook emphasizing classical learning and human potential, are sown not in hidden corners, but in the public squares of university towns, in full view through printed letters and essays. When Petrarch climbs Mont Ventoux in 1336 and later writes of the experience, reflecting on human endeavour and classical wisdom, his letter is quickly printed and read by intellectuals across Italy, earning him fame as the first modern man. The Renaissance, in essence, has been gradually unfolding for generations, powered by print that has long enabled Europe to stand on the shoulders of its ancient giants. This late medieval Renaissance is not confined to Europe. In the Mongol Empire of the 13th century, East and West are briefly united by conquest and commerce, and knowledge flows along the reopened Silk Road. Chinese artisans demonstrate woodblock printing to curious Europeans at Kublai Khan's court, while Persian and Syrian scholars under Mongol patronage exchange texts with Chinese Confucian and Buddhist literati. Tales even tell of a movable type printing set, captured in a raid on a Persian city, being sent as a gift to the court of the Great Khan. Though the story's veracity is uncertain, it symbolizes the bridging of information cultures. By the 14th century, printing in East Asia is flourishing in its own right. The Song and Yuan Chinese print agricultural manuals and mass-produce Confucian classics for the civil service exams, and Korea experiments with movable typecast from bronze. The world's great civilizations are all touched by the ethos of reproducible knowledge. They stand poised at the edge of an unprecedented era, an age when not just elite scholars, but artisans, explorers, and even common folk might partake in the accumulated wisdom of humanity. The curtain is rising on the modern world, not abruptly with the bang of a single invention, but as a gradual sunrise that has long been coming. What follows in the 15th and 16th centuries, the voyages of discovery, the shake-up of church authority, and the leap into scientific revolution, will all be amplified and accelerated by the foundation built during these long centuries of print. Age of discovery and dissenters. The 15th and 16th centuries dawn. Europe stands on the brink of global expansion and profound spiritual upheaval. The printing press, by now an old ally of knowledge on the continent, plays a pivotal role in both endeavours. Explorers venture beyond Europe's shores, equipped not just with courage, but with printed maps, nautical charts, and travelogues compiled by their predecessors. In this timeline, the lore of distant lands does not languish in sailors' logbooks alone. It finds its way into print quickly, guiding the next wave of adventurers. The Vikings' medieval excursions to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, Newfoundland, were half-forgotten sagas in our timeline. Here, echoes of those journeys survive in print. Monastic libraries in Ireland and Norway preserve printed copies of Norse accounts of lands to the west, which circulate quietly among European cosmographers. Thus, when Iberian and Italian navigators begin plotting routes across the Atlantic, they do so with hints, however mythologized, that land lies beyond the sea. In 1486, when Christopher Columbus petitions the court of Spain for an Atlantic voyage, he carries a printed edition of Marco Polo's travels heavily annotated with his own notes. He also carries an unusual map pieced together from various printed portolan charts, and perhaps even a speculative copy of a Norse map from an Icelandic monastery, suggesting islands in the Western Ocean. The voyage Columbus undertakes in 1492 follows not blind intuition alone, but also these printed whispers of the world's geography. On the deck of the Santa Maria, under a dome of blazing stars, Columbus stands with a printed map spread on a barrel. By lantern light, he traces a speculative island marked far to the west. His sailors, many illiterate but trusting their admiral's learned guidance, watch him murmur calculations gleaned from his books. In that quiet night, the ocean stretching black to the horizon, a navigator's loneliness is eased by the rustle of pages, the collective wisdom of earlier travellers, reminding him that land may lie ahead. He recalls a line he read in Marco Polo about lands rich with spices and gold, and it steels his resolve. Above, the Milky Way arches across the sky, the same stars charted in his astronomical tables below deck, printed guides he consulted before this crossing. Folding the map carefully, Columbus offers a silent thanks for the knowledge preserved and promised by print, then turns his eyes to the western darkness with hope. When he finally reaches the Caribbean, Columbus documents his findings in a report that the Spanish promptly print, with some censorship and embellishment, for distribution among European courts. Within months, translations appear in Rome and Lisbon. The immediacy of print turns Columbus's gamble into a sensation. Rivals like John Cabot and Amerigo Vespucci embark on their own expeditions, armed with Columbus's printed letters and maps that now include sketchy coastlines of the New World. By 1520, Europe's knowledge of the globe has expanded exponentially and uniformly. Maps of the Americas, Africa's coasts, and the sea route to Asia, rounded by Vasco da Gama, are standardized in printed atlases that merchants and captains can acquire in Antwerp or Venice. The age of discovery accelerates, propelled by this shared pool of printed knowledge. Navigation manuals, such as improved star charts for the southern hemisphere encountered by Magellan's crew, find their way into print for future navigators, making each voyage less perilous than the last. The encounter between Europe and the indigenous civilizations of the Americas is also influenced by print. Missionaries arriving in Mexico and Peru bring with them portable presses, a practice Spain historically adopted soon after conquest. But here it happens even more swiftly and systematically. By the mid-1500s, presses in Mexico City and Lima are printing catechisms in Nahuatl and Quechua, a as well as bilingual dictionaries and ethnographic accounts of native customs that are shipped back to Europe. Some curious Aztec and Inca nobles learn the art of the press, printing broadsheets in their languages to share news and political commentary among their people, though under colonial scrutiny. In one fascinating episode, a Dominican friar prints an illustrated history of the Aztecs as told by native informants, resembling the Florentine Codex, but widely copied, ensuring that even as the old ways are suppressed, they are at least recorded and disseminated in Europe. Thus, the first global exchange of information begins. American plants, remedies and observations, like the use of quinine or the maps of the Mississippi drawn by natives, appear in European printed natural histories, while European ideologies and religion flood the Americas via millions of printed pages. Back in Europe, the unity of Christendom, already subtly weakened by centuries of diverse thought in print, faces a breaking point. The Catholic Church, which for so long managed to maintain doctrinal control, now struggles in a world where the written word is not confined to ecclesiastical scriptoria. The seeds of Reformation were planted earlier. Jan Hus in Bohemia had his Czech-language sermons and tracts secretly printed in the early 15th century, spreading his call for reform beyond Prague's university to the merchant classes and rural nobility. Though Hus was burned at the stake in 1415, his ideas lived on in thousands of pamphlets hidden throughout Central Europe. The Hussite wars that followed were fueled in part by printed manifestos rallying the common folk under slogans of religious renewal and justice, making it impossible for church authorities to quash the movement merely by executing its leader. By the time Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk in Saxony, pens his 95 Theses in 1517, the machinery for mass movement is firmly in place. Luther's theses, nailed to Wittenberg's church door, are almost immediately typeset and printed in both German and Latin. Within weeks, copies spread across the German states. Within months, they are translated and reprinted in France, England, and Italy. The reaction is explosive and accelerated compared to our timeline, where even then it was swift. The Church's attempts to contain Luther's challenge are met with a deluge of printed rebuttals and counter-rebuttals. Luther becomes the central figure of a Europe-wide controversy, but he is not alone. Other reformers like Zwingli in Zurich and later Calvin in Geneva also harness the presses to broadcast their doctrinal visions. The pamphlet becomes the weapon of choice in this battle for hearts and minds. Pointed, accessible writings in vernacular languages that ordinary literate townsfolk and even rural villagers, when read aloud in taverns and marketplaces, can grasp. The ideas of salvation by faith, the critique of indulgences, and the call for scripture in common tongues find an unprecedented audience. The Catholic Church, of course, does not remain idle. It, too, makes use of the printing press to defend its doctrines. Polemical works by scholars like Thomas More and Erasmus, who, in this timeline, saw his Greek-Latin New Testament printed far earlier and in greater numbers, feeding reformist thought but also scholarly Catholic rebuttal, circulate to counter the heresies. The papacy commissions printed pamphlets, extolling the authority of tradition and the Church's role in salvific grace, and later, the decrees of the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, are printed in bulk and dispatched across Catholic Europe to enforce a unified counter-Reformation front. Yet the sheer volume of religious debate pouring off the presses makes uniform control impossible. Different regions of Europe consume different narratives. In one city, broadsheets depict the Pope as a devouring dragon. In another, Luther is caricatured as a wild boar ravaging the Lord's vineyard, imagery both sides in fact used. The press thus pluralizes authority. No single voice can easily stamp out the others. The immediate consequence is decades of religious turmoil and wars. The Peasants' War in Germany, the French Wars of Religion, the Dutch Revolt, the 30 Years' War. All are intensified by printed propaganda rallying populations along confessional lines. However, one could argue the conflicts, while bitter, come to exhaustion and resolution slightly sooner than in our timeline, where in our world ignorance and rumour often fanned the flames. Here the population, inundated with printed arguments, perhaps reaches fatigue and a grudging acceptance of coexistence a bit earlier. The concept of religious tolerance, championed by minds like Sebastian Castellio and later Baruch Spinoza, finds a foothold when their eloquent pleas for conscience's freedom are printed and read by princes and merchants weary of interminable strife. By the mid-17th century, pamphleteers across Europe, Protestant and Catholic alike, begin advocating that secular authorities permit a patchwork of faiths to avoid endless civil war. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ends the 30 Years' War, explicitly acknowledges the permanence of religious division, a reality everyone has learned through print as much as through bloodshed. Thus, by 1650, Europe has undergone a 1-2 revolution. It has discovered vast new worlds, expanding its horizons physically and intellectually, and it has broken the religious monolith that once bound its spirit. In both cases, the printing press was the invisible hand turning the pages of history. It distributed the maps and journals that flung open the globe, and it broadcast the ideas that split Western Christianity into pluralism. Out of these convulsions, new institutions arise. State-sponsored science academies share geographical and botanical findings from the colonies in printed proceedings. Meanwhile, the various Christian denominations, forced to coexist, gradually develop a more literate, informed laity attuned to reading and interpreting for themselves. The stage is set for the next great epoch, one where reason and inquiry might finally overtake dogma and tradition, armed with the tools of print that have been sharpened over so many centuries. Revolution and Enlightenment. The 17th and 18th centuries propel humanity into a new era of reason and invention, and the long-standing presence of print magnifies every step forward. In laboratories and observatories across Europe, natural philosophers swap discoveries at the speed of print. When Galileo Galilei observes the moons of Jupiter through his telescope in 1610, he hastens to publish a report of his findings, The Starry Messenger, in a well-illustrated printed booklet. Thanks to the continent's mature print networks, Galileo's telescopic revelations spread like wildfire, being read in London, Prague, and Constantinople within a year. The immediate dissemination means that other astronomers, from Jesuit scholars in Rome to merchants turned stargazers in Amsterdam, are able to confirm, refute, or build upon Galileo's claims without delay. A pan-European scientific conversation ensues, often heated, but always documented in print. By mid-century, scientific journals, a novelty in our timeline, have already become established. The Royal Society of London's Philosophical Transactions and similar journals in Paris and Leiden find receptive audiences and contributors, building on a culture of correspondence that had existed for centuries. The difference now is that these letters and findings are quickly typeset and distributed to all interested savants. As a result, the scientific revolution isn't confined to small cliques in a few capitals. It reverberates through the educated middle classes of many nations. This vibrant intellectual environment fosters breakthroughs. Descartes, Newton, and Leibniz all publish their works with confidence that they will be swiftly read, critiqued, and understood by peers everywhere. Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, the dense mathematical explanation of gravity and motion, is printed not only in Latin for scholars, but within a few years appears in an English edition for the wider learned public, complete with diagrams and an editor's commentary to aid comprehension. The availability of Newton's ideas in vernacular form accelerates their acceptance beyond academic circles. Ship captains, artillery officers, even watchmakers leaf through simplified summaries of Newtonian physics in printed almanacs and technical manuals. Likewise, medical knowledge surges ahead. Anatomical atlases with detailed engravings, building on Vesalius's pioneering 16th century prints, are common reference books in physician studies from Madrid to Moscow, ensuring that new surgical techniques or understandings of the human body circulate rapidly. By 1700, the educated of Europe share a more uniform foundation of knowledge than ever before, thanks to print-leveling regional disparities. A self-taught inventor in Scotland can read the same French treatise on mechanics that a Prussian artillery engineer studies, and an Italian mathematician critiques in a journal article. As science sheds old dogmas, the Enlightenment dawns, a movement of philosophers and public intellectuals who champion reason, individual rights, and skepticism of authority. Here again, the printing press is the catalyst. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and John Locke find eager audiences for their essays and books, not just among elites, but increasingly among common citizens who have acquired literacy. Coffeehouses, salons, and universities across Europe buzz with debate, often prompted by a freshly printed pamphlet or the latest issue of a literary magazine. Importantly, this is a Europe long accustomed to wrestling with ideas via print. The shock of questioning kings and churches has been worn down by centuries of religious and scientific discourse. The Enlightenment's radical tracts face censorship, but smuggling printed matter is an old art perfected by dissenters. Printers in the Dutch Republic or in Switzerland churn out banned French books by the thousands and covertly ship them across borders. Concepts like freedom of the press and freedom of conscience, advocated by the likes of Spinoza, Bale, and later Kant, gain traction as philosophical ideals, in part because people can see in practice the benefits of open exchange in the printed domain. With knowledge democratizing, the late 18th century erupts in political revolution. In the American colonies of Britain, a highly literate settler population reads Enlightenment philosophy alongside newspapers and pamphlets discussing their rights. When tensions with the crown escalate, figures like Thomas Paine step forward with powerful printed words. His pamphlet Common Sense, 1776, makes the case for independence in plain language, and thanks to a network of colonial printers, active in Boston, Philadelphia, Williamsburg, and beyond since the 17th century, it reaches virtually every village and town in a matter of weeks. The American Revolution becomes, in many ways, a printed revolution. Committees of correspondence publish broadsides to justify their cause. The newly declared states issue printed declarations and bills of rights. And even the peace treaty, when it arrives, is heralded by newspaper printings throughout the land. Across the Atlantic, those same arguments echo in France, where a financial crisis and Enlightenment ideals brew revolt. In 1789, Parisian printers work around the clock producing newspapers and pamphlets for every faction, from royalists to Jacobins, fueling the fever of the revolution. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen is not only proclaimed in the National Assembly, but within days is posted on walls and read aloud in every provincial city that has a printing press, and most do. The literacy rate in France is higher than in any previous century, a legacy of cheap chapbooks and educational reforms nourished by print. So the revolutionary message finds receptive minds among artisans and even some peasants, not just the bourgeoisie. The result is an unprecedented mass participation in political life, guided and misled in equal measure by the torrent of printed words. The French Revolution's chaotic turns, from constitutional monarchy to republic to terror, are accompanied at each stage by propaganda wars in print. Marat's fiery newspaper L'Ami du Peuple inciting the sans-culottes, countered by royalist pamphlets smuggled in from abroad. In this tumult, one clear winner emerges: the principle that to mould public opinion, one must master the printed page. The revolutionary age, with all its blood and glory, also births modern nationalism and the idea of the informed citizen. As the Napoleonic Wars spread these concepts across Europe in the early 19th century, Printing ensures that even after Napoleon's fall, people remember the taste of discourse and debate. By the 1820s and 30s, nearly every European country has a vigorous press culture. Steam-powered printing presses, innovated by inventors like Friedrich Koenig by 1810, and somewhat earlier in this timeline due to the long-standing industrial tinkering tradition, allow for mass production of daily newspapers. Circulation numbers explode. In England, the Times in London prints tens of thousands of copies each morning by the 1830s, accessible for a modest coin, bringing news, serialized literature, and political commentary to clerks, shopkeepers, and factory workers. Across the ocean, young American democracy sees an explosion of newspapers in every city and frontier town, spreading both information and partisan rhetoric to an electorate that now includes more common men than ever before. Print, effectively, has midwifed the modern public sphere. The spark of liberty was not confined to Europe. In Latin America, educated Creoles in cities like Caracas, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City devoured forbidden copies of The Rights of Man and Voltaire smuggled past colonial censors. When Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 created a crisis of legitimacy, these colonies were primed for revolt. Revolutionary juntas set up their own presses as one of their first acts, printing newspapers and broadsides in Spanish that declared the rights of Americans to self-government. Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of North and South America, funded a traveling printing press that accompanied his army through the Andes. With it, he issued proclamations to the towns he entered, promising liberty and protection, and published a newspaper, El Correo del Orinoco, to counter Spanish royalist narratives. In one famous instance, Bolívar's printers turned out hundreds of copies of his letter from Jamaica, 1815, in which he outlined the vision of independent republics in the Americas, and these copies found their way across the Caribbean, inspiring patriots even beyond Bolívar's reach. By the 1820s, Spanish rule in the New World had collapsed under the weight of ideals spread on ink and paper, as much as by battlefield victories. The printing press, introduced to the Americas by empire, thus became the midwife of independent nations across two continents. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution is in full swing, propelled by knowledge sharing that print made far easier. The development of steam engines, for instance, was accelerated by widely available technical literature. James Watt's crucial improvements in the 1760s were aided by his access to printed scientific papers on thermodynamics and vacuum pumps, dating back to Otto von Guericke and Denis Papin, and by correspondence with fellow engineers through journals. Once Watt's design proved its worth, printed engineering drawings and descriptions proliferated, allowing mechanics in France, Germany, or America to replicate and adapt steam technology rapidly. By 1800, textile mills in Britain and the American Northeast hum with power looms whose designs were disseminated via printed patent specifications and trade manuals. Coal mines from Wales to Wallonia use printed instructional pamphlets to safely manage their new steam pumping engines. The cross-pollination of ideas extends globally. A Japanese visitor to Europe in the 1850s, for example, collects armfuls of technical books to bring back home as Japan embarks on modernization. Indeed, Japan's own woodblock printing tradition, centuries old, allows those imported ideas to be quickly digested and reprinted in Japanese. Industrial know-how, no longer confined to one inventor's workshop, becomes part of a collective human endeavor documented in print. By the mid-19th century, the world is knit tighter not just by steamships and railroads, but by the printed word traveling along those arteries. An educated middle class, from Boston to Berlin to Bombay, reads many of the same authors and scientific theories. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, sells out its first print run in both London and New York within weeks, and is soon translated and printed in German, French, and Russian, igniting a global debate on evolution. Newspapers report the latest telegrams from abroad, but also run extensive excerpts from parliamentary speeches, scientific congresses, and literary works, feeding a cosmopolitan appetite for knowledge. Crucially, mass education has become a policy goal in many states, precisely because an industrial economy demands literate workers, and the ideology of the era values an informed citizenry. Countries like Prussia implement primary schooling for all boys and girls, and printing presses supply the needed textbooks in bulk. By 1870, most of Western Europe and North America approached near universal male literacy, with female literacy not far behind, a dramatic leap from a few centuries earlier, and one largely attributable to the availability of affordable reading material and the social expectation of reading as a necessary skill. The printed word even begins to challenge social norms and spur reform. The abolitionist movement against slavery, for instance, uses pamphlets and serialized narratives, like Frederick Douglass's autobiographical writings and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, to sway public opinion across the Atlantic world. In this timeline, with literacy higher earlier and the press more pervasive, abolitionist literature finds an even broader audience among working-class readers, bolstering the moral force that leads to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire by 1833 and the United States by 1865. Likewise, early feminist tracts, Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, or the Proceedings of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, are printed widely, seeding ideas of women's rights well before they blossom into 20th century suffrage movements. Nearly every emerging ideology or cause in the 19th century, from socialism to nationalism to religious revivalism, spreads through print as its lifeblood. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848, knowing that the revolutionary uprisings of that year will carry their words swiftly through Europe's printing presses. By the time the dust settles, their call, "Workers of the World Unite," has been translated into multiple languages and debated in countless radical club meetings. Print has made ideas borderless, turning local grievances into transnational movements. As the 19th century draws to a close, humanity stands at an unprecedented pinnacle of technological progress and global interconnection. The long arc of the printing revolution is visible everywhere. Electric lights and telephones may be new marvels, but the very knowledge that created them stems from generations of printed science and engineering. Empires span continents, administered through reams of printed forms and gazettes binding metropole to colony. The world's great cities support dozens of daily newspapers and cheap novels by the hundreds of thousands, creating a truly mass culture for the first time. And in that mass culture, ideas move swiftly. An injustice in one corner of the world, a famine, a colonial atrocity, can become common knowledge and spark humanitarian action, thanks to the global newspaper networks and the pamphlets of activists. The motto of the Enlightenment, sapere aude, dare to know, has seemingly been fulfilled. Empowered by print, humanity dared to know and did not cease in its quest. The stage is set for the 20th century, which will bring challenges and horrors on an unimaginable scale, but also the tools to confront them, forged largely through the shared knowledge that printing made possible. A different modernity. The 20th century in this alternate world unfolds along familiar lines. Two devastating world wars, rapid technological advancements, the Cold War, decolonization, and the rise of a globally interconnected civilization. Yet beneath the surface, the long legacy of the Roman printing press has subtly shaped the path and tone of modern history. As nations grappled with war and ideology, the pervasive printed word influenced how people understood and reacted to events, often with critical consequences. When the Great War, World War I, erupted in 1914, it was fought by armies of unprecedented size, drawn from populations that were nearly all literate. These soldiers and the civilians on the home front were readers of newspapers, novels, and school textbooks. They entered the war with minds already conditioned by national narratives propagated in print. Governments on all sides, aware of the power of media, engaged in massive propaganda campaigns using posters, pamphlets, and newspapers to maintain morale and demonize the enemy. In our original timeline, such propaganda was a new and potent force. In this timeline, the public was perhaps more discerning, having a longer tradition of reading competing viewpoints. War correspondents at the front sent back dispatches that were printed in detail. The literacy of the masses meant that public opinion could swing based on reports of battles or atrocities, forcing generals and politicians to consider the new front of information warfare more than ever. Some historians suggest that this accelerated end to the conflict once it became clear through the press that a total victory was untenable. The outcry over pointless carnage, fueled by harrowing frontline descriptions in print, pressured leaders to seek armistice by 1918, rather than entertain prolonged quagmire. Amid the mud and shell craters of the Somme in 1916, a young British soldier crouches in a trench, rifle by his side. During a lull in the bombardment, he reaches into his tunic and pulls out a small, crumpled pamphlet. A trench newspaper printed a week ago in the rear lines. By the light of a flickering candle stub, he reads a poem titled "In Flanders Fields," the printed verses offering him a strange comfort and a link to countless others enduring the same hell. Further down the line, another soldier shares yesterday's London Times, its pages damp and smeared but still legible, bringing news of a world beyond the wire. In that grim theatre of war, the printed word serves as solace and sanity, proof that ideas and beauty persist even when surrounded by death. Such moments are repeated a millionfold across battlefronts, as fighters on all sides carry books of verse, prayer leaflets, or simple newsletters that remind them of home and hope. It is a far cry from the days when only officers or nobles could read dispatches. Now the common man in uniform has his own window onto events, however small and smudged, and it shapes how he understands why he fights and what might come after. A French poilu nearby, on sentry duty, hums a line from a Victor Hugo poem he had seen in a newspaper before the war. Even here, culture quietly sustains them. After the war, the same print-saturated environment shaped the peace and the turbulent decades that followed. The Treaty of Versailles was not a document hidden in diplomatic archives. Its contents were printed in full in newspapers across the world, stirring debate and resentment openly. The nascent League of Nations communicated its principles through journals and bulletins, trying to forge a global dialogue that echoed the Republic of Letters of earlier centuries. Yet, the very openness of information also gave space for extremist ideologies to take root in societies disillusioned by war and economic collapse. The 1920s and 30s saw fascist and communist movements expertly use print, alongside the new media of radio and film, to spread their messages. In this timeline, where populations had long been accustomed to questioning and analyzing printed arguments, some nations proved more resistant to totalitarian propaganda, while others still succumbed. For example, Germany's Nazi regime flooded the country with pamphlets and books on racial theory and national destiny. Many lapped it up, but a significant undercurrent of skeptical readers, steeped in Enlightenment literature and critical thought, quietly circulated counter-narratives. Sadly, even a well-read public is not immune to fear and fanaticism, and the march toward World War II proceeded, though perhaps with a more robust internal resistance. Indeed, underground presses flourished under fascist and communist censorship. Clandestine publications kept liberal and humanist ideas alive in the darkest times. In occupied France, the resistance published surreptitious newspapers urging unity against Nazi tyranny, and, in the Soviet Union, typewritten samizdat literature, a practice ironically harking back to early secret printing by oppressed groups, disseminated works by banned poets and dissident intellectuals, preventing the total erasure of independent thought. World War II's massive scale was matched by an equally massive information war. Allied troops carried pocket guides, printed booklets explaining the cultures and languages of the lands they would liberate or occupy, reflecting a conscious effort to use knowledge as a tool of peace. When the war ended in 1945, the horrors of the Holocaust and the atomic bomb were laid bare to the global public largely through printed reports and photographs in newspapers and magazines. The immediate post-war period saw an explosion of publishing. Veterans wrote memoirs, analysts printed treatises on how to avoid future wars, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, was printed in dozens of languages and posted on the walls of UN refugee camps and government offices worldwide, asserting a new global ethos in the most literal black and white terms. In the latter half of the 20th century, the role of print evolved but remained fundamental. The arrival of new media, radio, television, and eventually the internet, might have seemed to eclipse print, yet they all built upon and amplified the literate, knowledge-sharing society that the printing press had nurtured. Consider the scientific and technological leaps. The space age, for instance, was propelled by generations of printed science, rocket engineering manuals, physics textbooks, and the published proceedings of rocketry conferences were indispensable to Soviet and American scientists striving to touch the moon. When Neil Armstrong's footprint marked lunar dust in 1969, he carried with him experiments and checklists that were, only recently, lines of text on paper, and the world learned of the achievement through newspapers headlined, "Man Walks On." Moon, connecting that moment back to the tradition of Gutenberg's broadsheets heralding news from far-off lands. The Cold War's battles for hearts and minds also centered on print. Libraries stocked with ideology-laden books, clandestine smuggling of literature behind the Iron Curtain, and the publication of dissident works like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which, although officially banned in the USSR, found eager global audiences and eventually filtered back into Soviet society through illicit copies, eroding the credibility of the regime. Meanwhile, the reach of printing truly became worldwide. Colonized peoples in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, many of whom had gained access to print literacy under colonial rule, turned the press into a weapon for independence and nation building. Leaders like Mahatma Gandhi in India deftly used newspapers to stir mass civil disobedience against the British Raj, and did so writing in English and Gujarati to reach both colonial officials and ordinary villagers. When India won independence in 1947, one of its earliest acts was to ensure a free press, recognizing the role print had played in forging a national consciousness. Across Africa in the 1950s and 60s, nationalist newspapers rallied public sentiment against European empires, and newly independent states launched print literacy campaigns, aware that political freedom would be hollow without an educated, informed populace to sustain it. Literacy rates soared as education spread. By century's end, global literacy approached universality, a dramatic transformation from the world of 1500, when perhaps only 1 in 10 persons could read. The printed word, whether on cheap paper pamphlets or bound in textbooks, was the ladder by which billions climbed out of ignorance. China, which had pioneered its own woodblock printing centuries before, found its literati eagerly absorbing Western scientific and political works during the 19th century Qing dynasty. Reformist officials of the self-strengthening movement established printing bureaus to translate and publish treatises on everything from international law to engineering, hoping to rejuvenate their empire by learning from abroad. These efforts spread new ideas among China's educated class, contributing to the debates that would eventually lead to the end of imperial rule in 1911 and the search for a modern Chinese identity. By the year 2025, the world of our alternate timeline looks in many ways like our own, a humming, hyperconnected planet grappling with challenges like climate change, pandemics, and social inequality, yet it carries a deeper memory of the long journey of knowledge. People walk through cities filled with words, electronic billboards scrolling news, storefronts emblazoned with text in 100 alphabets, all descendants of the humble letters once carved for a Roman press. The ease with which information flows and replicates in the digital age has its roots in the attitudes forged by print. We take for granted that multiple copies of a document will exist, that backups will preserve our data. This mindset harkens to the scribes of Rome who first saw their work mirrored perfectly by machine, freeing words from the vulnerability of singularity. We expect, too, that knowledge should be accessible, a principle championed by generations of librarians, teachers, and activists stretching back to the great library of Alexandria and the copyists of monastic scriptoria, but truly turbocharged by the printing press's democratization of learning. Culturally, the long tradition of printing has given modern society a rich inheritance. Literary and philosophical traditions did not have to be rediscovered in Renaissance or revived in Enlightenments. They flowed continuously, often interacting in real time. Imagine a modern student in this timeline studying philosophy. She can trace unbroken printed debates on ethics from Aristotle and Confucius, the latter's sayings printed in China since the 11th century and in Latin in Europe by the 17th, through medieval scholastics and Enlightenment, freethinkers right up to contemporary commentators, all available in her university, library, or more likely on her digital device, which holds an archive of millions of books in a format Gutenberg would dimly recognize. The canon of literature is broader and more inclusive too. Texts from non-Western civilizations entered the European print stream far earlier, meaning the global literary canon that students study in 2025 features perhaps Persian poetry, Indian epics, and Chinese classics alongside Greco-Roman and Western masterpieces, reflecting a more syncretic intellectual heritage for the modern world. The Persians had their Shahnameh, the Indians the Mahabharata, the Arabs their 1001 Nights. All these and more found their way into print over the centuries of interaction, and thus were not relegated to exotic curiosity, but became part of the shared fabric of human storytelling. The Persians had their Shahnameh, the Indians the Mahabharata, the Arabs their 1001 Nights. All these and more found their way into print over the centuries of interaction, and thus were not relegated to exotic curiosity, but became part of the shared fabric of human storytelling. Technologically, one might argue this world leapt ahead in certain respects. Continuous preservation of scientific knowledge and cross-cultural fertilization could have led to earlier inventions in some fields, perhaps electricity harnessed a few decades sooner, or medicine progressing faster, such that vaccines and antibiotics were developed slightly ahead of our schedule, potentially saving countless lives. But history is complex. Human folly and wisdom coexist in any timeline. The 20th century still saw horrific wars and genocides, depressions and discriminations. The printing press could spread enlightenment, but it could just as easily spread hate. The difference often lay in who wielded it and for what end. What is clear is that when crises struck, humanity's reservoir of knowledge was fuller. Facing a deadly pandemic, scientists around the world, long connected through journals and data sharing, were able to identify a pathogen and coordinate a vaccine with remarkable speed, building on each other's printed and digital publications, without the hindrance of secrecy or parochial hoarding of insight. Facing environmental decline, activists marshaled centuries of printed data on climate and ecology to make their case to a literate public that could read the reports and judge for themselves, putting pressure on leaders to act. The challenges remain great, but the tools to confront them, education, open discourse, the scientific method, are universally accepted ideals, largely thanks to their profound validation through centuries of print-fueled progress. In this world born from an Augustan invention, Perhaps people hold a slightly keener awareness of history's fragility. How different things might have been if knowledge had faltered, if the wisdom of Greece and Rome had flickered out, or if the Reformation's Bible wars or the political upheavals of modernity had not been tempered by the availability of dialogue. Museums in Rome might display one of Marcus Aurelius's original wooden presses as a treasured artifact, celebrated as much as any triumphal arch, a symbol of creation more than conquest. And everyday citizens, though immersed in the digital now, feel a lineage with those ancient artisans and scholars. When they open a book, for books still exist, even if joined by ebooks and virtual texts, they open a door through time, one that in this timeline was never forced shut by scarcity or forgetting. The Romans, by inventing the printing press, unknowingly gave their distant descendants an unbroken continuum of memory. Our modern world, seen through the lens of this alternate history, confirms a truth often stated: knowledge is power. The mechanical press did not change human nature. People continued to love, hate, create, and destroy as they always have. But it changed the playing field of human endeavor by empowering ideas to endure and spread. Ultimately, it reminds us that the free flow of information, which we cherish today in our globally networked society, stands on foundations laid long ago. The Romans sought eternity through monuments and laws. In this timeline, they achieved it through printed pages that carried their legacy forward in living dialogues rather than dusty archives. It's a different modernity, perhaps a bit wiser, perhaps only marginally better, but one where the torch of knowledge was never fully extinguished, passed hand to hand in a chain of light from ancient times to the present. Epilogue. The sun is rising once more, as it did in our story's beginning. Now it peaks over the skyline of modern Rome, where ancient ruins lie comfortably amid the hum of a living city. In the hush of early morning, a young historian walks among the columns of the Forum with a book tucked under her arm. A book that, in this timeline, was never lost to time. She finds a seat on a broken marble capitol and opens her worn copy of Livy's History of Rome, a direct descendant of those first prints run off under Augustus. As she reads, the stones around her seem to speak, not with ghosts of what might have been, but with an unbroken continuity of memory. Birds begin to sing in the cypress trees around her, and the noise of the waking city builds softly in the distance. The historian closes the book and runs her hand over the Latin text, reflecting on how extraordinary it is that she can read the thoughts of a man who lived 2,000 years ago, unbroken by time's erosion. She imagines Marcus Aurelius, that half-legendary inventor, standing here with her, beholding the world his device has wrought. Perhaps he would marvel at how Rome's legacy outgrew its empire, living on in every book and screen. Perhaps he would simply smile and be content. As we conclude this journey through an alternate past, let us reflect on how pivotal that one innovation proved to be. The Romans who lived and died, never knowing what their printing press would spark, could not have fathomed. A world where a vast chorus of human voices, across continents and centuries, engage in a dialogue through the written word, where knowledge builds upon knowledge in an endless tapestry. Yet, in this imagined timeline, they gifted such a world to their descendants. It is a world that illuminates our own by contrast, showing how our achievements rest on the fragile threads of memory and communication. History, real or alternate, reminds us that the path of civilization can turn on small hinges: a battle avoided, a book preserved, an invention made a little sooner or later, and that from those turns, entire futures spring. In the present day, when billions of people carry libraries worth of text in their pockets and exchange messages instantly across the world, it's easy to forget the long road here. But the tap of a touchscreen or the glow of an e-reader is only the latest chapter in the story that began with ink pressed to papyrus. The digital age inherited its mindset from the print age, the idea that knowledge should be recorded accurately, copied widely, and available to all who seek it. Those ancient printers, the medieval copyists, the Enlightenment pamphleteers, they were early nodes in the grand network of human communication that today spans the globe. This alternate history of a Roman printing press highlights something fundamental: the resilience of knowledge when it is widely shared. In our timeline, much was lost and had to be regained. In this one, wisdom flowed forward continuously, an ever-growing river. It leaves us wondering, what currents of possibility run silently alongside the history we know? Asking what if does more than entertain. It shines a light on how our world came to be and how easily it could have been otherwise. It teaches us to cherish the gifts of the past, the books, ideas, and innovations passed down. For they are the inheritance that shapes our present and our hope for the future. If this gentle voyage through a world of printed possibilities has intrigued you, I invite you to join our growing community of history dreamers. Consider subscribing to Nocturne of History for more explorations into the twilight realms of what might have been. And now I turn the question to you. Where are you listening from tonight? And what alternate history would you like to wander through next? Feel free to share your imaginings in the comments. Until we meet again in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, I wish you peaceful nights and vivid dreams. Dreams illuminated by the soft, steady light of history's endless stories. Thank you for listening, and remember, the past is never truly gone as long as stories live on.